Welcome to another episode of Case of Interest Kohberger. I'm Newswatch 16 Stacey Lang. This is an update that I will admit I did not expect to be providing to you today. If you've been following the Bryan Kohberger Idaho 4 case at all, you've likely heard by now that there is a plea deal in the case. Bryan Kohberger has accepted a deal, agreed to plead guilty, and we now know officially from the Ada County Court in Boise, Idaho, that a hearing has been set. That order was just posted the case of interest page. I'm looking at it right now, 11 a.m. on Wednesday, July 2nd, in front of Judge Hippler, who would have overseen a trial if a trial had happened. There is a hearing, and we now know through multiple sources and from the victims' families that this is the opportunity Bryan Kohberger has to plead guilty. We expect that this hearing is going to be rather short. Any kind of victim impact statement or possibly even an elocution from Bryan Kohberger, which we don't know if we're going to get, won't happen until the time of sentencing. We might have a clearer idea at that hearing tomorrow when sentencing might be. It can be a matter of weeks. It could be a matter of months until a sentencing hearing is set. But we do know, we have a picture of what the deal says. Bryan Kohberger has apparently agreed to plead guilty to every charge against him, which is 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each of the victims, and 1 count of burglary. He's agreed to 4 consecutive life sentences, which is just a poetic way of saying he's going to remain in prison for the rest of his life without the possibility of parole. He also gives up the opportunity to appeal the case, which if he had been convicted and if he had been sentenced to death, he would have had a lot of appellate rights that would have potentially tied up this case for years and years and years before an execution. So that's, I'm sure, one of the things that both the defense and the prosecution, and I think the victims' families, were considering in hammering out this plea deal. Now, you'd think usually with a plea deal, this spares not only Bryan Kohberger from facing the potential of death, it would also spare the families from the agony of having to go through a trial that was at this point scheduled to last potentially 5 months. But the family's reactions appear murky here. We're getting conflicting reports about how much they were involved in the conversation, if at all, and whether or not they agreed to this plea deal. One family we've heard from loud and clear from the very beginning is the family of Kaylee Gonzalez. Her dad, Steve Gonzalez, has been very vocal since the beginning of this, and they were very vocal yesterday when this news broke, initially putting out a statement just confirming that the plea deal existed and that they were not happy about it. And then they put out a lengthier statement on the family's Facebook page, and I wanted to read that to you. It is powerful and sheds some light on how maybe this wasn't dealt with the best way, regardless of whether or not you think that this is the best outcome. And there are a million different arguments on whether or not this is a good outcome, bad outcome. I think we could say, based off what the Gonzalez family is alleging here, that maybe was not handled properly. Let's take a look at this statement. The death penalty is merely an illusion in the criminal justice system. When available, it serves as a bargaining tool for the state. And when rarely applied, it's never enforced due to a highly inefficient appellate process. The notion that someone can plead guilty to a crime and still face years of appellate delays reveals a systemic failure. The Latah County Prosecutor's Office, again, as an aside, Latah County is where this case occurred. That's where the University of Idaho is. The trial had been moved to Ada County, which is where Boise is. But it's the Latah County prosecutor who's been handling this case from the very beginning. The Latah County Prosecutor's Office treatment of our family during this process is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. We questioned decisions early in the investigation. Why was the mayor commenting on the case? Why was the coroner speaking to families? Why was an officer with less than 2 years' experience leading the investigation? Why was the University of Idaho involved when they declared it an isolated off-campus incident? Why was the university permitted to write a book about the incident while others were silenced under an overly broad order? He's referring to the gag order there that remains to this day. As a result, we were branded adversaries. So it was no shock how the Latah County Prosecutor's Office mishandled the plea deal. They vaguely mentioned a possible plea on Friday without seeking our input and presented the plea on Sunday. We heard it, when I say we, the public and the media found out about it on Monday. Latah County should be ashamed of its prosecutor's office. 4 wonderful young people lost their lives, yet the victims' families were treated as opponents from the outset. We weren't even called about the plea. We received an email with a letter attached. That's how Latah County Prosecutor's Office treats murder victims' families. Adding insult to injury, they're rushing the plea, giving families just 1 day to coordinate and appear at the courthouse for a plea on July 2nd. Who do they think we are? After more than 2 years, this is how it concludes, with a secretive deal and a hurried effort to close the case without any input from the victims' families on the plea details. Our family is frustrated right now, and that will subside, and we will come together as always and deal with the reality that we face moving forward. Once again, we thank everyone for their thoughts and prayers. So, as it has been from the very beginning, this is complicated, emotional, and there are so many implications. To help us get some understanding of what is being implicated here with this plea deal, we reached out to a trial attorney in Philadelphia, Dennis McAndrews, who's been a frequent guest here on Case of Interest and has extensive trial experience both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, to kind of help us understand what's going on behind the scenes here, and really the emotional and practical and even moral implications of this plea deal. So listen in.
I think it is fair to say that there was collective shock from people who have been following this case from the beginning when we hear yesterday that there's going to be, potentially a guilty plea. Would you say that you felt that emotion as well?
No,
No? Okay.
no. And I'm a little surprised that so many commentators are shocked by it. Look at how many cases settle, whether civil, criminal, as the trial approaches. It is when all the motions are behind them, the day of reckoning is coming. Everybody now knows exactly what they can prove, what they can't prove, and what the risks are. And it's when everybody gets into what I call the risk management mode. Defense is getting into the risk management mode because they know that the likelihood, very strong likelihood, is that there will be a conviction and that their client will be sentenced to death. And so they are now looking to, for lack of a better term, cut their losses. And Kohberger is thinking, not only about him being executed, but he has a family too. And I mean, I know it's hard to think about someone who is charged with these crimes, but he's got a family too. And he knows that, hey, he's not going to be executed for 10 years, and he may be executed eventually. And so now think what his family will go through. That's not to diminish in any way what the victims' families will go through. What I was shocked about was client management on the part of the prosecution. That's in a case like this, client management is as critical as proving the case. They have plenty of evidence to prove the case. They're concerned about two things. They're concerned about the fact that there was another item of unidentified blood found at the scene. They're concerned about that. They're concerned about some of the pretrial rulings that could be fodder for appeal, that he can't produce, that he can't get an alibi instruction if he's his only alibi witness. So, they're concerned about that, and they know they're not going to execute him for 10 years. So they're going to be going through a lot for 10 years. They're going to be managing the client, the families for 10 years. And it's going to be in state court, in state appellate court, in federal trial court, federal appellate court, attempts to have the United States Supreme Court hear it. And then after 10 years, they have to see whether there's a constitutional way in Idaho, because they've had problems executing people because of their method of lethal injection. So, everybody's looking at it, and the prosecution is looking at it to think, we're probably going to convict him. We're probably going to get the death penalty, but is that blood on a handrail enough to inject reasonable doubt? And is this alibi instruction something that could reverse it on appeal? And the fact that the defense has a cell phone expert to say he was not in that area. Certainly challengeable, but nobody wants to be the man who failed to shoot Liberty Valance. And the prosecution, in the back of their mind, they won't say it publicly, but boy, we sure don't want to lose this case because everybody thinks we should win it, and frankly, they should.
Do you think that the last we spoke was when Judge Hippler came out and said he was calling for an independent investigation into leaks of information? Do you think that that is another thing that brings the prosecution to the table for a plea deal, or is that a separate issue?
I view that as separate, and the judge may well continue to go on with that. He views that as not only a trial fairness issue, but also a potential disciplinary issue for whomever was involved. So I think he would actually look bad if he just backed off and said, "Okay, no harm, no foul." Although not everyone's going to be as remembering as you are, Stacy, and some people now are focused on other aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. Another thing, that us journalists do is we hesitate to speak in absolutes. So I hope I phrased it correctly when we started this conversation, but it's expected that Bryan Kohberger will plead guilty tomorrow at a hearing at 11 a.m. in court in Boise. There are a few wrenches that could still be thrown into that plan, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the victims are going to the families of the victims are going to have an opportunity to state why they oppose the plea. And the judge may take it under advisement. He may not decide tomorrow whether to accept the plea, or if he does accept the plea, defendants can withdraw their plea, especially prior to sentencing, which probably will not occur tomorrow. So, tomorrow will be an interesting day, and exactly how the judge handles it. Now, the judge wants to accept the plea. Judges like pleas. I mean, let's face it. It's a plea versus months long trial and certainty. Because this judge will now, if there's a trial, he'll get all the first rounds of appeals. And after those appeals are done, he will get the first rounds of ineffective assistance of counsel, the second level of appeal. So, this case would stay with him for a long time. And some of the victims we haven't heard from all of the victims' families yet. Some of them may well be happy to have closure, no appeal, and be done with it. Others obviously have spoken very vigorously against the plea deal, and it's understandable from both ends. Mm-hmm. Very, very understandable. Working with the families of murder victims is an entirely different paradigm than most other crimes.
Yeah, and I think any one of us who's been thinking about this and mulling it over since the news broke, I can argue both sides. That avoiding a trial and assuring he stays behind bars forever is enough. Whereas I could also see, if that was my child, how it would not be enough. So, and it seems like the details right now are a little murky about what level of agreement there may have been from the victims' families. Stephen Gonzalez was on cable news last night saying that they were all told about it on Friday and that not a majority opposed the plea deal. What does that mean necessarily? We don't know. And I don't know whether or not we will know. Speaking of details we may or may not know, the journalist in me is frustrated that we aren't going to get all of the information that we would have gotten in trial. Do you think, from what I can tell just from Google searching Idaho news or Idaho court proceedings, he doesn't have to allocute. Bryan Kohberger doesn't have to allocute, but he could. Do you think that's something that we'll get an allocution?
Well, Yeah, in most cases, there's a delay between the plea and sentencing.
Hmm.
Allocution occurs at sentencing. And it's interesting, Stacey. You raise kind of a an interesting point, at least for me, because to plead guilty, you have to admit to certain facts, and oftentimes, especially in very heavily contested cases and very public cases, the prosecution, the facts that they present at a guilty plea are not everything they have. And the reason they do that is because you're asking the defendant to admit to the facts that the prosecution stated. And if there are some a defendant doesn't want to admit to, you may not say them. And in my years as a prosecutor, I always was very careful at a significant plea to make sure I was stating facts that I knew the defendant would admit to. And if there were some that I knew he didn't want to, for whatever reason, um, I would omit them and would very quickly at the end simply say, "Do you understand these facts?" and admit to them, so that I would get that yes,
Yeah,
and then we could move on.
yeah.
And
I've seen
that's
that
part of
before.
the reason. That's part of the reason the plea's occurring tomorrow. Defendants change their mind. They want everybody who wants that plea, which are right now the lawyers and perhaps the judge. They want to move ahead with this before they change their mind. You see that in federal court a great deal, where there's a lot more secrecy, and then all of a sudden there's a plea, and sometimes they walk into court the same day. Uh, Here that wasn't gonna because it wasn't gonna fly.
Right, right. And I think that is in part because of the letter sent to the families. That's how we first became aware of it.
That was to do it by email was that was the shocking part to me. Uh, I, that's going to take some explaining.
Yeah, yeah.
The phone system works, and they've got multiple prosecutors. It doesn't have to be the lead prosecutor with everybody. You can have four people who are intimately involved make the calls right at once, and then follow up, the lead prosecutor calling everybody. Just to do it by email, I mean, uh, uh, wouldn't happen on my watch.
Yeah, yeah. Seeing as you have been in big trials like this for both the defense and the prosecution, practically, one of the things that if I'm living in Idaho, especially, I'm thinking about is the saving of taxpayer dollars. Do you Could you make a ballpark guess as to how much a 4, potentially 5 month trial of this magnitude would have cost the state of Idaho?
Um, well, I don't know that there was a final decision yet about sequestering the jury. That is far and away the most expensive cost,
Mhm. Yeah.
uh, because you're talking lodging, food, and court staff keeping an eye on them. Court staff, a judge has discretion how to handle it, but in the sequestered juries that I've had, I mean, they would not let the jurors watch TV unless there was a court officer with them to turn off breaking news, so those are the primary costs if the jury would be sequestered. If the jury was going to be sequestered, and they're paying defense counsel, they're paying defense experts, probably at least some of them. Uh, you know, Recognize that a lot of these people are salaried. The prosecution, the court staff, the judge, so they'd be doing something, But so how do you factor in those costs? When I prosecuted John DuPont, I was actually a special prosecutor and was paid independently, so they could actually tabulate my costs, and he paid my salary, which I was kind of happy about. Um, but if they are sequestered, I would say 10 million. If they're not sequestered, several million.
Well,
And at what cost justice? You know, I will say, in the cases that I've had, we never really thought about, all right, how much is this going to cost? Because how much does it cost to not get an appropriate verdict? And usually in a case like this, county government recognizes the stakes and does what has to be done to make sure, at least that the prosecution team has what they need.
And this feels like a moot point that right now, but I'd have to think that they were seriously, or the judge was seriously considering sequestration, because we're watching all of these other major trials happening here in 2025, and nearly every single one of them has a juror issue. I'd have to think, and then we have the leaks of information with this case specifically. Did you feel strongly that sequestration was the direction they were going to go?
Stacy, it's a great question, and the thing is, if I was the judge, I'd sequester. It eliminates so many of the issues that you and other reporters have talked about. It is a tremendous hassle to sequester juries, and I think that the broad public doesn't realize that. You're giving them 3 squares a day. You're making sure their lodging is appropriate. You're making sure that no one is trying to influence them. You've got court officers that have to sleep there as well, and probably some that have to be awake as well. So you're watching what they can read, what they can see, what they can hear. Um, Sometimes I've had sequestered juries where families called the judge and said, "My wife's got to get home. Nobody's cooking for me." I mean, just dealing with that kind of stuff happens fairly routinely with sequestered juries. So judges don't like doing it, but they also recognize that it can uh, at least protect the jury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, just because of where we're sitting, the timing is curious. Yesterday, before the news broke about the plea deal, we Newswatch 16 was in Monroe County Court in Stroudsburg, covering the 7 or so witnesses that have been subpoenaed to appear in Idaho. 2 of them agreed without putting up a fight. The rest of them are seemingly putting up a fight. Some of them pretty audibly to not go. We were wondering if that was influencing the decision towards a plea deal as well, or is that just inconvenient timing?
I think it's probably more inconvenient timing. The slogan is oftentimes uh, to move towards a settlement, prepare for trial. And the defense is showing we are preparing for trial. And the question of whether these folks are forced to come or not to come, and on whose dime that's going to be, probably again that adds to the cost for the county or the jurisdiction. um, uh, is just another potential appellate issue too. If people don't show up to try to testify for the defense, and let's say the jury's sequestered. Okay, what are you going to do with the jurors while you're fighting over getting these people in Monroe County to get themselves to Idaho? And literally, I mean, I've had sequestered juries take bus trips to the Franklin Mint and other places. It's one of those headaches a judge has to deal with, and where you have all these witnesses and many from out of state, that's rattling around in the judge's mind too, that I'm going to have to keep people occupied and happy, or reasonably happy, while stuff goes on as it does in these trials.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The last thing I want to ask you about, just because it was an interesting way of thinking about it, and I'm paraphrasing, but the Gonzalez family statement that was put out last night, they said something to the effect of, we've been fighting this long battle for essentially 3 years, almost 3 years, and now they feel like they've lost the war. If Bryan Kohberger pleads guilty tomorrow and is then subsequently sentenced to 4 life sentences, in your opinion, is that losing the war?
Well, they say that history is written by the people who prevail in a war. And, the families, only they can decide in a battle like this whether they've won or lost the war. from me, I will say that as a prosecutor, my feeling was if someone will plead, and in Pennsylvania, it's life without parole, there's no parole, period, end of story. And obviously, you would talk with the families at length. But if somebody is willing to plead to life without parole, uh, that's a very substantial victory, at least for the people of the Commonwealth, because that person will never, outside of a very secure correctional institute, hurt anyone again. And, you know, and I'm trying to decide how to say this with sensitivity. For the most part in this country, we execute volunteers, not entirely, but people who just give up on their appellate rights oftentimes. So Kohberger would not be executed for at least a decade, maybe more, maybe never. And again, with tremendous respect for what the families have gone through, I don't think they really can appreciate what those next 10 years would be like, uh, because they may be dragged back into court. They would certainly be constantly informed. They'd want to go to these court hearings. And in the final analysis, would he ever be executed? Only they can answer that question. I can't answer that question. But they have to be listened to, that they have to be heard. And you may have different feelings from different family members. Hey, I've had family members who have said, look, I don't want that person executed. He killed my daughter, but I don't want him executed. I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't think it serves a purpose. I've had others who can't wait, for the execution to occur. So it's as divisive as our country is divided on it. And, I prosecuted a dorm room killing of a contract killing of a girl at a university who was killed at an end of the semester dorm room party because she had agreed to testify against someone. And so I remember what it was like for those family members to know their daughter's not coming home from college. I mean, it's heartbreaking beyond words. And I don't think any of us can fully appreciate it. At the same time, having been through long, long appellate processes, I don't know that the families can appreciate what they will go through going forward. So it's a mixed bag of emotions.
That was attorney Dennis McAndrews, again, with really an insightful take on what's going to happen now with the plea deal and the reactions from all of the families and what could happen next. We won't know for sure until the ink is on the paper, switching his plea from not guilty to guilty. And again, that is scheduled for 11 a.m. on July 2nd. That's Wednesday. Newswatch 16 will have extensive coverage of that hearing, and we will be here on Case of Interest to break it all down for you afterwards. Thanks for watching.